Hey everybody, it's Erik co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with the return of a very special guest back for round two, Byrne Hobart. Byrne, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
Glad to be here.
So Byrne, one topic you're thinking about right now is the fox hedgehog dichotomy, and I'm curious how you think about it because you are someone who is able to write across a wide variety of interests with some resonance and expertise, and so I'm curious how you think about that construct.
Yeah, sure. So the fox hedgehog dichotomy is between artists or, well, people in general who either know a lot about a lot of different topics or who have one really fundamental insight that they can apply over and over again. It's originally a scrap of Greek poetry, but it was popularized in this essay by Isaiah Berlin. And actually the substance of the essay is mostly about Tolstoy and his literary influences and his understanding of history. So 90% of the essay has nothing to do with that distinction. It's just something that Isaiah Berlin brings up at the beginning of the essay to frame the discussion. So it's kind of weird that everyone cites it as Isaiah Berlin when it's really somebody else. Anyway, it's an interesting dichotomy because at some level you can think of some public figures as being foxes, so having a lot of knowledge on a lot of different topics, or as being hedgehogs, like really focused on one thing. So Malcolm Gladwell talks about a whole lot of different things, always sort of has pseudo-insightful things to say about them. And then Nassim Taleb has just one insight, which is that there are a lot of phenomena that are modeled as normal distributions that actually have fat tails. And over a long enough time frame, the fat tail is the only thing you care about, because the thing that determines your outcomes in a variety of domains is whether or not you actually survive. So I found that an interesting framing, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized, so naturally I think about this in terms of investors, because I just know more about investors, asset managers, hedge fund managers than a lot of other topics. And it seemed like there were a lot of investors who were foxes, where they have no one core insight, like a lot of the quantitative funds. There's no one signal they're using. They're using lots and lots of signals. Depending on how you slice it, you can say they're using dozens, you could say they're using thousands or tens of thousands. But really, what a lot of quants have done is they found this key insight, which is that human beings are fallible and that you can measure how fallible they are by looking at historical financial data, and then you can trade against them at the moment of peak fallibility and use that to generate consistent profits. Everything they actually do is some variation on that core insight. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there are a lot of intellectual figures who you might think of as a fox, as someone who has a lot of different disparate bits of knowledge, but actually they have one core insight. So I think Gladwell's insight is basically there are a lot of scientists with interesting ideas who are not very good writers. And so if you're a good writer and you just meet someone who says something that sounds unconventional to you, and you can write it up for the New Yorker, that you can consistently generate insightful-ish commentary. So Gladwell, not really a fox. When you look at historical polymaths, someone like Isaac Newton spent most of his time on theology, spent a lot of time on alchemy, and also dabbled in math. It looks like he has a lot of different interests, but really he was a very religious guy, and part of his religious views were, he wasn't strictly a deist, but they were kind of deistic, where he thought that the natural universe was orderly, and that reflected something about the presence of the divine in the world, and the Bible also reflected that presence. So really the calculus and predicting the date of the apocalypse and trying to synthesize gold from base metals, all part of the same intellectual exercise for him. He was just, he was not someone with a ton of different interests. He was a person with one and only one interest who was insanely smart at pursuing that interest through a variety of angles.
Yeah, we're sort of having a broader conversation in culture around specialization versus generalization. There was this the book Range that came out, which I didn't read, but as far as I can tell, sort of justified to a lot of generalists that is what optimal. Tyler Cowen talks about himself as specializing as a generalist. How do you make sense of this conversation, those 2 points, or is it better to be a specialist or a generalist?
What I would say is that it is a tempting line of argument to say that being a generalist is good, but the problem is it is really easy to lie to yourself and say that you're a generalist when what's actually going on is that you've tried a bunch of things and you flake out when they get difficult and then you try something else. So that is one way to be a generalist, is just quit whatever you're doing as soon as it gets difficult, but that's also a way to fail at everything you do.
That's
And like some people who are generalists now, they haven't always been generalists. Like Tyler Cowen writes about a whole lot of different topics, but he's also really good at economics, and that was his original main focus. So and maybe he was always a bit more of a generalist and polymath who happened to be going to grad school of economics and then teaching economics. But certainly that is part of the story, is that you should actually be really good at something. If nothing else, it's a test of whether you are a legitimate generalist or just someone who doesn't have a lot of grit and persistence.
It's almost like own a vertical first and then go horizontal.
Yeah, exactly. That it's entirely possible that you pick the wrong thing at first, but at least you want to give up because you have pushed yourself to some kind of limit rather than because you ran into some random obstacle.
Do you buy the Scott Adams advice of find sort of the intersection of 2 or 3 things that you are best at, even if you're not best at any of those things? Scott Adams, of course, was pretty good at comics and pretty good at, I guess I don't even know what the other thing is, business, writing.
Yeah, I think his argument was that he is funnier than average and a better artist than average, and that he knew a lot about business because he spent all day in a cubicle. So yeah, his argument, it works good as a backup plan, because really it is a little bit lame to build your entire life around finding this sort of random Venn diagram. On the other hand, it is a good way to specialize without being the absolute best at something. So I would view it as reasonable advice on average, but as also advice that will make you slightly above average, but not necessarily excellent. Also, it can make you really, really excellent if it turns out that you do it at the right time. So in Scott Adams' case, the economics of cartooning were really, really good in the 80s through the 90s. There were lots of daily newspapers. They were all printed in color. So if you were a cartoonist and you got widely syndicated, then you could make a lot of money with this very scalable job. Whereas now cartooning is more something that people have to do because they actually love it. A lot of daily papers have had declining circulation for a decade plus. The newspaper is getting smaller, the printing budget is getting lower. So he did have the right timing when he managed to wrap those interests into the same project. And then he turned himself into more of an online brand. Like I don't think I've encountered Dilbert in a physical newspaper in a decade or more, but I do see Scott Adams on Twitter or see links to his writing or see people
he's managed to sort of like it's almost like I have this friend who was an actor in Mean Girls, he was the gay guy in Mean Girls, and he built somewhat of an audience from that, but he hasn't been able to convert it. Dilbert is relevant, but everyone's like, oh yeah, that's the guy from Dilbert, and he managed to like transfer that like initial maybe social capital with a celebrity capital into something else, i.e. predicting Donald Trump's rise.
Yeah, he has this weird combination of being overconfident on politics. I'm talking Scott Adams, although this applies to Trump too. Overconfident, but actually directionally right when everyone else is leaning the other direction. So he manages to be able to say that he did call it, but also to have been able to make a huge, huge splash at the time. And I know Scott Adams has written he has his own theory of rhetoric. It's tied in with his theory of hypnosis. And so he has this pseudo argument for why that the facts don't matter, that when he said landslide, it was actually a sort of marginal victory, like it was an electoral college victory, and that's all that matters in the current system. But it certainly wasn't the kind of landslide that Adams was hinting would happen. But if he'd been one of several people saying Trump actually is more likely than you think to win, but he's still probably going to lose, that wouldn't have been especially interesting, whereas Adams could dominate at least the Twitter news cycle by saying, no, there's a 100% chance that Trump wins in a massive, massive landslide.
One other thing that you've thought quite a bit about is finance as a metaphor for everything, and transaction cost is the reason that metaphor is limited. Why don't you unpack what you mean by that?
Sure. So the first half of that is that finance is full of these really robust metaphors for any kind of human activity where you have a known upfront outlay and some uncertain distribution of future returns, whether that's a distribution over time or magnitude, whether that's a distribution where you have capped upside or unlimited upside, whether it's a situation where your exposure to some phenomenon keeps rising as it does better, or your exposure goes up as things get worse. So it's basically for any kind of career decision or a lot of political decisions or almost any decision in your life, you can think of it in terms of financial theory. You can ask yourself, am I buying a call option? Am I selling a call option? Am I making a loan? Am I doing a swap or something even more elaborate than that? So that makes finance just a really good way to think about decisions. Basically, a lot of decisions, you can think of them in options terms where you are either making a bet that something does better or worse, and you're also making a bet that volatility goes up or it goes down. So if you were to go to law school and get a job at a large law firm, you're betting against volatility. You're betting that the future looks a whole lot like the recent past, just a slightly better version of it. So in that sense, your position is sort of analogous to selling puts. If volatility goes up, then you're probably going to lose out, even if you don't know specifically what source of volatility would cause you in particular problems. If you join a startup, very analogous to a call option, you actually care a lot more about volatility than expected value, because the modal outcome for a startup is that you would have been better off working at Google. So you care about raising the variance enough that there's some remote chance that you make enough money to totally change your life. Or even if you're not caring about the monetary outcome, it's still arguable that if you worked at Google, you'd have a bigger impact on society, because if you take some tiny 3-pixel shift in one piece of the Google user interface and multiply that by the billions and billions and billions of Google searches that are happening every month, it's probably every day, it's the net impact on any one person is minuscule, but the net impact in the aggregate is huge. So to have some aggregate impact, you have to take enormous risk, even if you think that the expected outcome of that risk is actually worse than the outcome of not taking the risk. So that's where I get a lot of the financial metaphors, is really from the world of options. But a lot of those metaphors don't perfectly apply. And there is, fortunately, a whole body of economic thought that explains why, which is, it's mostly derived from the work of Ronald Coase and others who followed in his footsteps. What Coase says is that there is a whole set of legal outcomes, legal uncertainties, where the ideal way to frame the outcome is to act as if we had these extremely high resolution property rights. So Coase will talk about situations like, I believe there was a dentist, and he would use his drill on patients. Someone opened a factory nearby. The factory had a lot of heavy equipment. The equipment caused vibrations. The vibrations caused the dentist drill to slip and injure his patient, so he sued the factory. And eventually, a lot of English common law actually reflected this idea that implicitly there is this property right to a vibration-free environment. And what Coase said, which was really interesting, was we don't actually know in advance whether you should always decide in favor of the dentist, always decide in favor of the factory, or what. But if you treat that as a property right, then you ask, who's the high bidder for that property right? Is the dentist more willing to to pay? And is the factory either going to buy better equipment or shut down or relocate, or would the factory be better off paying the dentist to relocate himself? This leads to some kind of morally tricky outcomes, like one of the implications of Coasian economic theory is that if there's a factory that's going to pollute a lot, it should probably be located in a poorer part of the country or a poorer part of the world, because those people would be not willing to pay as much for the factory not to be there. So it can go in some dark directions, but at least it gives you a framework for evaluating this question of, if people step on their toes in a way that you didn't think was physically possible, who's at fault? Is it the toe stepper? Is it the person who stuck their toe out? Coase says we should be agnostic with respect to that, but we should create some sort of property right in toe stepping and then decide who pays and how much they pay, or decide who gets it based on who pays how much. But what Coase also admits is that the reason that the whole world doesn't function this way is that transaction costs are too high. So if I live in an apartment building, if one of my neighbors is playing really loud music, in theory, maybe it's worth $2 to the neighbor to play that loud music, and it's worth $3 for me to have a quiet evening. So I could knock on his door, offer him $3 if he turns off the music, and we're both better off. But in practice, the reason that's not going to happen is that it's extremely awkward. Like, I would pay $20 not to have that conversation, so the conversation doesn't happen. And in some hypothetical sense, I'm $20 richer, even though I'm annoyed by the base. The transaction cost element of a lot of decisions that you can model as options, it comes into play both because you don't have this totally homogeneous continuum of options. You can't choose between this portfolio of, well, I want 80% of my career right now to be at a big company and 20% to be at a startup, because that's the risk I'm comfortable with. No, it has to be 100% or 100%. There's no real way to balance it out. And then there are also the emotional aspects of the decision, or the qualitative ones, that don't quite map to this financialized vision of the world. So maybe you're considering a big company job, you're considering a startup job, you think about these two options, you run the numbers, you decide expected value of a big company job is higher in basically every reasonable scenario, but you're passionate about the startup, or you really want to work with that team, or the startup is in the same city as your significant other, and the big company's job offer is halfway across the country. So you make the decision based on something else. So you can always try to put dollar values on it, but at that point it just gets ridiculous. At that point, what you can do instead is you optimize for the qualitative stuff, and then you satisfice on the financial stuff.
Totally. And the crypto community often quotes Coase and transaction costs because they're saying they're trying to remove them in some sort of systematic way. How would you unpack that, or are you sympathetic to the possibility of doing that?
Yeah, I am. It is hypothetically possible to use crypto to create all sorts of interesting micropayment layers, all sorts of interesting machine-to-machine transactions. You can think of all of these hypothetical market maker type activities that could happen to more equitably or more efficiently distribute the world's computing and informational resources that don't happen just because if you're paying 30 cents plus 2% of every transaction, and someone has to consciously choose to do a transaction and has to enter their credit card number, that the frictional costs are just too high. Whereas if you could pay in Satoshis and your cost of transferring those Satoshis was zero or close enough to zero that it didn't matter, then that would be fine. It is notable that if you think pre-crypto, there were basically two globally successful micropayments networks. One was Google AdWords, and the other was the postage stamp. These are both cases where people were routinely spending sub $1 amounts and actually felt like they were getting a good deal and didn't feel like the cognitive burden was too high. But in both cases, those were micropayments platforms that were built by monopolies. In Google's case, it was a company that had a technological and then a distribution monopoly. In the USPS case, because they had a government-enforced monopoly on first-class mail. So what that might tell you is that crypto is step B in a plan where step A is actually the really hard part, and that you can imagine all these ways to reduce transaction costs, but the transaction costs only go down if you have a network effect. If you have two parties that both have crypto, are willing to spend crypto, and have services, have demand for trade between each other. And at this point, since crypto penetration is so low, it's just really hard to find those cases. The only real exceptions right now are either illegal drugs, where it is pretty hard to build a really robust micropayment system because you have the macro payment of shipping costs and also the risk of arrest. And then there's also this semi-robust microtransaction compatible environment involving margin loans for crypto speculation. But it's always super worrisome to me that the really exciting applications of all the promise of crypto are enabling people to make margin bets on crypto prices. That just it seems clearly unsustainable and also somewhat disappointing. And more dangerously, it's something that could crowd out more interesting micropayments options.
So how do these financial metaphors segue into relationships, where you like to use Darwinian metaphors?
Yeah, so Darwin is super convenient when you're talking about human behavior because you can always back into an evolutionary explanation. There was a joke on Twitter years ago where someone said that the reason evolutionary psychology is so popular is that in our ancestral environment, it was extremely high status and would get you access to really high quality mates. You could always tie any phenomenon to Darwinism. So yeah, there's always this incentive to over apply it. It's a theory of everything, and you can always come up with this ex post explanation for why it all makes sense. Sometimes there's a really, really good explanation for why phenomenon X is compatible with evolution and is like totally proof that we are all just machines for propagating our genes. And then it turns out that this phenomenon doesn't actually exist. And so that's a little bit awkward for evolutionary psychology. But it is true that one of the claims that Darwinian evolution makes is that if you do optimize for the propagation of your genes on the margin, so just in general, that is one of your priorities, that if you are in Darwinian competition with everybody else. But if you and one other person have enough kids together, then your largest net genetic investment is in your kids. And that has two effects. One is it means that you have this Darwinian incentive to cooperate with one person. So it's this war of 7 billion people against 7 billion people, except you have one person who you can actually say is cynically motivated to be on your side. But the other thing is that it moves your locus of Darwinian focus into the future, since you're not just optimizing for your life today, your immediate genes, you're also optimizing for the expectation that your kids will have kids and those kids will have kids and so on. So it lowers your discount rate significantly. And so part of my view on why a committed monogamous relationship is just a really useful piece of social technology, why we should actually be really, really cautious about the increasing availability of divorce, or at least the social acceptability of divorce, is that it does align incentives really well, and it gives two people a reason to build this family unit that's going to persist for a long time. It's going to behave in more pro-social ways. And if you have a lot of people who have this Darwinian alignment in the same direction, then you have a lot of people who have a collectively low discount rate, and that seems to be where wealth and civilization come from. Of course, the irony there is that a lot of civilization, like a lot of artistic and intellectual achievement, is not actually produced by people who have really, really boring normie family lives and lots of kids. A lot of it is actually produced by people who move to the big city and are single for a really long time or have these really tempestuous relationships or whatever. So it isn't a perfect argument. It's very much an argument for a certain set of middle class values rather than this set of more aristocratic or more bohemian values. But it does appeal to me, and it is a nice way to map this totally cold amoral Darwinian calculus to the decision to spend the rest of your life with someone you fell in love with and make a family together.
Yeah. Are you sympathetic to this critique? Well, I guess to broader critique. One is any institution that is not right, explicitly right wing, becomes left, and then two, that the culture always moves left over time, and that I was thinking about this in the context of polyamory, or monogamy seems more of like a rightist, cultural or conservative cultural institution, and to the extent that the culture always moves left, might your piece be contrarian or not on the right side of history?
I could be on the wrong side of history. History could be on the wrong side of me. We'll see how that goes. I would say that both of those observations are true, that things tend to move in a leftward direction, that any institution that's not explicitly right-wing does become left-wing over time. I think when Robert Conquest came up with that observation, he was either explicitly talking about the Ford Foundation or thinking of the Ford Foundation. But if you compare how the Ford Foundation behaves to the sorts of things that Henry Ford believed, you definitely would think that Conquest had a point on which direction that shift goes. In terms of why it is, there are a couple ways that you can think about that. One is to say that the right is traditionally associated with maintaining things that seem to work. Like that's the Steelman argument for being conservative, like lowercase c conservative, not strictly for voting Republican, but for having conservative tendencies, is that we have this whole set of traditions that have been subject to a lot of evolutionary pressure, that people have experimented with all sorts of different social relations and forms of government, forms of economics, and the ones that we have today are probably the ones that work. But that's also a recipe for stasis. So you don't want, there's a point at which you definitely do not want the conservatives to have won every single debate. And certainly a lot of that, a lot of the leftward drift has been good for people like me and for a lot of people who I know and care about. So it's really hard to turn one's back on that. There's this sense in which every conservative, every generation is saying, okay, it's gone this far and we can't let it go any further than that. And then if we look back, typically our view is that those conservatives were wrong. But there's also that survive versus thrive trade-off, where typically the things that make society temporarily more conservative are major stresses. So if there's a crime wave, people tend to vote much more conservative, much more in favor of law and order. If you ever look at the electoral map in 1972 and wonder why it was just such a blowout for Richard Nixon, you can read the book Days of Rage, read about all bombing campaigns and assassination attempts and things that were going on in the late 60s, early 70s. And then it sort of makes sense that people would be really freaked out and they would actually really long for this restoration of order. You can go further back and say 1940s, 1950s, people came back from World War II and they just wanted to be as hyper normal and hyper conformist as humanly possible. So you had this peak of forming a family, having a bunch of kids, living in the suburbs, having a car, etc., being as conformist as you could possibly be. So that's another case of conservatism being this response to outside stress. So in that sense, you can say that things tend to drift leftward over time if life is good. That does mean that you'll see a positive correlation between more progressive values and more widespread prosperity. It's tempting to view that as causal. It's possible to view that. So the neutral way would be to say that we fluctuate in terms of how progressive or conservative we are, depending on how well things are doing, and that these two viewpoints are unrelated. The progressive viewpoint would be to say that as society gets more advanced, we're able to more fully support human flourishing, and that means being more progressive in all aspects. And then the conservative counter-argument to that would be, no, conservatism is building this enormous reservoir of social and civilizational capital. Progressivism is spending it down over time. And so you do have people who are more materially prosperous, who might report being happier, but you're actually chipping away at the foundations of that. I'm not sure there's a good way to synthesize that, other than to say that we've had progressives and we've had conservatives since the dawn of human history. There's always been someone on the left and someone on the right. And so neither of those traditions would be as durable as they are if they didn't have some useful points to make about the human condition.
Yeah, I wonder if it's sort of this sort of equal and opposite to the sort of software is eating the world a little bit. We were talking about in the last podcast about egalitarianism and meritocracy, and it seems while conservatives, certainly like libertarians, have lost sort of the culture war or socially, but they've won economically. And as the world gets increasingly, meritocratic economically, it gets increasingly progressive socially, and these are sort of constantly in tension. Is that way too simplistic?
Yeah, like clearly, a lot of progressive causes have triumphed in the culture war. There's one sense where you can say you can have this Whig history view of we've been making progress up to this point, and that we'll continue making progress. But then it gets kind of nerve-wracking, because if you take things that are socially acceptable today and were not socially acceptable 40 years ago, and you ask yourself, how unpopular were they 40 years ago? How unpopular are the things that me and all of my friends think are fine 40 years ago? And then you ask yourself, well, what is something that is that unpopular today that I should be supporting now because this is the direction of history? You get to a bunch of pretty weird, uncomfortable stuff. So one possibility is just that we've reached some point of moral perfection. One possibility is that there's a pendulum. It gets really tricky. You can't really trust anyone who has really strong definitive judgments. Anyone who thinks we have it all figured out, you have to wonder if they would have said that 50 years ago or 200 years ago. Would they be saying that if they grew up in Iran or Saudi Arabia or China or somewhere, or Japan? Like, would they still have this temperamental trait of saying whatever state we are in today is the highest moral order that anyone could achieve, and it's great, and coincidentally that means that every belief I espouse doesn't get me into any sort of trouble, either for being too conservative and reactionary or for being too hyper progressive and libertine. So yeah, it's tough to trust anyone with extremely definitive views, and it's very healthy to have a sort of skepticism about whether there is just one direction or whether there's only a direction because there's a narrative around progress for the elements of progress that happen. There's not a narrative that calls it progress if we have enough data points to see that it's fluctuated.
It's interesting, I was saying that they were at odds, but actually there's some places in which they're totally compatible, and maybe dating. Let's say we're having this conversation of marriage and dating in like 10 to 15 years. Do you have any predictions for how things are going to be different?
So marriage and dating 10 to 15 years from now, I would actually expect people to get fairly burned out on this hyper meritocratic, hyper transactional model of dating, where finding someone who you want to marry and actually getting married turns into something kind of close to the Ivy League admissions process, where you have to do a lot of things exactly right. You have to optimize every element of the process. You have to be ready to fully commit to whoever it is who accepts you, and you don't actually know in advance whether it'll be the one you really, really wanted or the one you're willing to settle for. It just ends up setting a lot of people up for disappointment. There's just a point at which having a lot of options and being able to explore all of those options means that you can make a lot of unfavorable comparisons to whatever option you end up picking. Whereas if you don't have as many options and you don't have as much time to sample those options, you have a lot more time to get to know one person and to build a relationship with one person. There's also the question of whether the dating process should be thought of as this process of each person trying to find emotional fulfillment with someone else, such that you have two people who are going to each make each other happy in this utilitarian way, or if what you're actually doing is trying to form a family unit, and so you're optimizing for this future family unit, which you do have to build and cultivate. So in that sense, marriage is not, like the actual wedding is not this moment where you celebrate the culmination of anything. It's actually the moment where you throw a big party to recognize that there is an enormous amount of hard work ahead. So it's a little bit more of a Mardi Gras ahead of the long Lent kind of feeling, rather than just a party.
And broadly, if I were to say, how do you think the culture war is going to play out in the next like 2 decades? Would you have a similar answer, or how would you like, an escalation followed by de-escalation, or how do you think about that?
One of the things that's going on with the culture war is that on both the progressive and conservative sides, people have they have these weapons that they can use against the other side, but they can also turn them on each other. So there's this dynamic within progressives where there's sort of this fractally vicious infighting where you're always trying to prove that someone else who is part of the same progressive movement you are is not as ideologically pure as they should be. That happens a lot to conservatives too. It seems just anecdotally to be a lot more vicious on the progressive side. And progressives are certainly very good at evicting people from conservative public life for being excessively conservative. It's just once you know that you can do that, it's really, really tempting to go after someone who is a more proximate rival. So what I suspect is that by building all of this offensive social technology, you've just ended up in a situation where everyone is on offense all the time. People will get really burned out, they'll get really sick of it, and there will probably just be this pendulum swing, if not towards more socially conservative outcomes, at least towards people having more of a healthy respect for what social conservatives are trying to say. Like they're not evil. Some of them are just cautious. Some of them have extremely thoughtful critiques that can be boiled down to evil sounding soundbite. But there's no good reason to think that we've figured it all out right now. There's no good reason to extrapolate whatever trend happened in your lifetime and assume that it's going to happen indefinitely. A lot of these things have to be figured out every generation, and there are some cases where we get less libertine on certain axes that we just don't think of as being part of someone's civil rights or being just part of the progressive agenda. So one example of that is if you go back to prohibition. Prohibition was a huge progressive cause. The book Last Call actually argues that women's suffrage as a movement was basically a political tool to enact prohibition, that these movements were very closely tied. So if the 18th Amendment passed and you were a progressive looking back on recent history asking about the March of Progress, you'd say that progress means increased suffrage, increased political participation, and it also means banning intoxicating substances. So if we extrapolate forward 10 or 20 years, we'll have higher voter turnout, more educated voters, and coffee will be banned. But it didn't happen that way. The trend you were extrapolating turned out not to work, but people don't think of the world today as being socially conservative because liquor stores still exist. In fact, the political valence of substance use has gone in a totally different direction. I would assume that, like within drugs, there's a little bit of partisan ambiguity. Like I would assume most people who smoke pot are progressive. I would assume most people who do cocaine are pretty conservative, or at least vote Republican. I think they're like Romney Republicans, except on Friday and Saturday night. But it has lost some of its political valence, which means you no longer see it as part of that arc of progress. So if you're looking 10 or 20 years ahead, if you are 10 or 20 years ahead, you might have the same general sense that you have today, where we generally progress towards more freedom and more human flourishing. But if you were looking to that point from today, you might be surprised that in some cases, some things have been ejected from what counts as a measure of progress, and that progress as we measure it in 2020 has actually moved backwards in those domains.
Totally. It makes me think of a few things. As you know, there are books that tend to get popular in Silicon Valley, Sovereign Individual, which we spoke about last time. Girard, who's sort of interest in Girard has perhaps been very Girardian itself. And then also most recently, Dominion by Tom Holland, which basically argues that the West is sort of Christianity without Christ, You mostly got, they like to think it's Enlightenment thinkers that weren't religious, but really a lot of it stems back from Christianity. And his big concern is that human rights, the foundation without its theological roots, is not as strong. That it was emboldened by Hitler and the Nazis, because instead of the devil in hell, you had Hitler and Germany, Nazi Germany. But as time moves on, we will forget that too, and we won't have as strong of a base to protect human rights. I'm curious if you've heard about Dominion, or if you have a reaction to that.
Yeah, I may get the pronunciation wrong, but Erik, I believe Vogelin wrote a lot about this phenomenon, about Christianity and pseudo-Christian ideologies. He has this really interesting framing where he says that the big ideologies of the 20th century are all actually examples of the Gnostic heresy of Christianity, where the Gnostics were basically this subset of Christians who believed that earthly perfection was attainable through human activity. So it was sort of, not quite, but sort of the idea that heaven is a metaphor for the society we can build on earth. And what Vogelin says that was really appealing to people on the left is Nazis were trying to build this Gnostic paradise on earth. It's just the way they defined paradise was German, very hyper-nationalistic, very, very racially focused, but they did think that they were building some kind of earthly paradise. And then Vogelin made the conservatives very happy by saying the communists are trying to build an earthly paradise where it's ruled not by the German Volk, but by the worker, wherever that worker is. And then he made everyone really uncomfortable by saying that the West is also trying to build this version of earthly perfection. We're not just splitting the difference between fascism and communism. We're actually doing our own version of heresy. But his basic argument was all of us today, all major political movements are in fact Christian heresies that are just so academically and theologically bankrupt that they don't even realize that that's what they are. He's probably taking it to an extreme, but it is definitely a fun mental workout to explore that. And I do agree that a lot of our beliefs about things like human rights and human limitations do in fact derive from Christian tradition, simply because Christianity has been around for so long. It has been the common cultural reference point for so many people in the West for so long that we don't really realize that we have this Christian moral substrate to a lot of our beliefs. That doesn't mean that those beliefs are exclusive to Christianity. Certainly, a lot of the elements of the Sermon on the Mount appear in many other faiths as well. It certainly doesn't mean that anyone in U.S. politics or European politics adheres especially closely to the Christian view, although you can push back on that as well and say that Christianity does articulate a role for the state and a role for the church. They're not the same role, that you should render unto Caesar, but that you should be a Christian first. So in that sense, you can argue quite reasonably that we have this Christian underpinning, that you basically, to build a post-Christian moral framing in the context of being the inheritor of this extremely long Christian legacy, you actually have to figure out what the break is between your views and Christianity. And if you try to build your views from first principles, you'll probably end up articulating a bunch of first principles that are straight out of the Sermon on the Mount, and then sort of trying to do that without the divine element. Maybe you'll get pretty far, maybe you won't. There's the whole story of Thomas Jefferson trying to create a more morally centered, less supernatural version of Christianity by cutting all of the miracles out of his copy of the Bible and just leaving it as a series of parables and moral teachings. But Jefferson was not exactly Christian in his personal life. So maybe thinking that hell is real and you will go there if you engage in certain bad behaviors, maybe that is actually healthy, even if the rules themselves are good rules to follow, even absent any kind of divine inspiration or divine threat.
Totally. And is it worth getting to how this relates to financial bubbles in Medium Post, or is it?
Yeah. So since religion and finance are both related to this question of making immediate sacrifices, having long-term outlooks, they do tie into each other somewhat closely. And then you can even find these more narrow parallels, like when you take your company public, you go to this big building with columns. It looks like a Greek temple. It is in New York, but still closest thing we have to a Greek temple. When you actually take the company public, your assets are locked up. So it's sort of this financial equivalent to fasting for a while to see if you are actually worthy of this blessing. There are lots of weird little tie-ins, probably because both phenomena have been subjected to a lot of the same evolutionary pressures. So they've ended up recreating the same kinds of behavior in very different contexts.
You had a post also about what Girard can teach us about bubbles.
Yes. So Girard had a lot of interesting thoughts on human behavior, where human motivations come from, the role of jealousy, the role of scapegoating. And really the key insight that he had was that a lot of our desires are not original to us, that we actually develop desires by looking at what other people desire. So you think you want something, but really you want to be someone else who you think can attain that thing. And one of the things that Girard points out is that in a lot of love triangles in literature, as two people converge on the same object of desire, they get more similar. And the more similar they get, the more it's two people occupying a space that's only big enough for one person. So as they get more similar, they're more likely to come into conflict with one another. And that conflict is harder and harder to reconcile. So that's really easy to see in financial markets in a variety of ways. You can see that people try to emulate successful traders, successful funds. You can see that people will they'll look at one company that did really well in an industry. They'll try to find a smaller company that is following exactly the same path, but there's only room for one of them. So if you think you're investing in the next Amazon, Google, Facebook, et cetera, you're probably investing in a company that is going to have far inferior economics, and you're probably paying too much because other people are engaged in this same behavior. So that's one piece of Girard and bubbles. But another one is that Girard talks a lot about the scapegoating mechanism. So this is the idea that in a lot of cultures, we go through these cycles where something goes wrong in the culture. Girard thinks it's generally due to mimetic desire, but sometimes due to external pressures. We find someone who we decide is more powerful than we thought, but also has used their power incorrectly and has caused all these problems. We join together in this collective act of violence. We, since Girard is mostly talking in this case about either ancient history or some tribes that anthropologists studied more recently, the cataclysmic violence generally does involve murdering them, and then we sort of cover it up. We lie about what we did and why. We take the story and turn it from a story of a human being who we picked out and decided was evil for some reason and had to be killed, to this story about a god who, or a godlike human or a god king or something who was sacrificed or taken into heaven or died in some other very cosmically, theologically satisfying way. The scapegoating mechanism now is a lot less violent, but there is this tendency after a financial bubble ends to try to find specific people to blame. And now where this gets really paradoxical, which it's always been there, but it's something that I got from reading Girard, was that the process of taking a bubble and blaming some one person or blaming a small number of people for the collapse of the bubble, it's exactly backwards. Bubbles start when there's some innovation, either an innovation in capital markets or an innovation in the real economy, that leads to a lot of rapid wealth creation. Eventually, too many people are chasing the same assets, prices get all out of whack, and then prices collapse. But in that model, it's the ordering is basically the opposite of the scapegoating ordering. So in that model of bubbles, you start out with something that only a small people believe is viable, whether it's junk bonds in the 70s, tiny number of people were trading them, it turned into a huge market, or mortgage-backed securities in the 80s and 90s. It starts out with a small number of people. You could also look at anyone who was starting an internet company before 1995. Really, really niche interest. It's a small number of people who are actually interesting and distinctive. And then at the peak of the bubble, everyone thinks that it's a good idea to invest in these things. So everyone is participating. So we should actually reverse the order. We should say that you can blame a small number of people for all the wealth that was created, and then all of us need to share the blame for all the wealth that was destroyed at the end. But that's just not the way that humans work, and Girard articulates a lot of the psychological epicycles that drive that consistent behavior.
Are you more sympathetic to Austrian economics? When people talk about bubbles, they often say that they're created by government action or by monetary policy or fiscal policy, even though while they purport to be trying to fix boom and bust.
I think the Austrian model is a really elegant way to describe some aspects of the economy and human behavior. It doesn't strictly make predictions, so it doesn't end up being a good predictive model. What I tend to do, and this is going back to the fox versus hedgehog thing, is I tend to have a bunch of little heuristics and little parallels that I can apply in a lot of different contexts to build up a sort of impressionistic picture of what's going on. So I think a lot of the Austrian models are helpful. They're helpful for articulating a baseline, but they to the extent that Austrian economics tells you that all bubbles are due to either fiscal or monetary policy, that's just not true. There are forms of irrational human behavior. I think some people who would describe themselves as Austrian will concede this. They will say that government bureaucrats are not the only people who can spend way too much of other people's money. Bankers and hedge fund managers can do that just fine. So in that sense, being an Austrian doesn't strictly mean that you would view all bubbles as being caused by the government, but it's certainly going to be your bias. I guess I go back to the empirical question of, do people who are strict Austrians tend to get rich predicting when bubbles will happen and how big they will be? And the answer is generally no. Like, Austrian economists have predicted the collapse of every bubble that's collapsed since Austrian economics started, but they tend to predict it a bit too early, and so they tend to become cynical early and then really bitter as the people who ignored them keep making more and more money, and then very triumphalist when it ends, but they still in many cases would have been better off betting on the bubble and going along for the ride and maybe selling a little bit on the way up rather than having their assets mostly in gold.
I'm curious, in the next 50 to 100 years, whose stock in economics history is going to either rise or fall? Is Mises or any of the Austrians going to become more important or relevant, or stay the same as in irrelevant? You had a post about Alan Greenspan's legacy. I'm curious how you think about that, how that's going to evolve, and any other thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, so Greenspan's legacy is really interesting because it ties into this claim that you can have these really clean, pure, first principles based models, but to actually get anything done, you have to make a lot of compromises. And Greenspan, from the Sebastian Malvi biography that I read, he made a ton of moral compromises. I did not realize the extent to which he was at various points Nixon and Reagan's hatchet man on economic issues, but also on personnel issues with respect to the Fed and other economic policy making institutions. So Greenspan, he ended up being less of an economic thinker than I had thought, although clearly a brilliant guy, but a lot more of a political operator than I'd realized. And I think that's a useful lesson, is that if you could choose, if you wanted to make a positive difference in the world and you felt like your views were right, if you could choose between having a much, much better articulation of whatever those views are versus being a lot better a wielder of political stilettos to actually get those policies put in place, that you might actually choose the more cynical Machiavellian version, just because there's no point in having really, really brilliant theorists whose theories never get implemented. There is a point in having people who make a number of compromises but actually get the job done. There's also, with Greenspan, the debate over his record in the 90s will never truly end, because at one level, he did keep rates lower than people thought they would naturally need to be. He had good arguments for why this wouldn't lead to runaway inflation. It didn't lead to runaway inflation in consumer prices, but clearly asset prices were quite inflated by the late 90s, and the Fed could have done more to prevent that. It's interesting to look at that point in the 90s, though, and ask why Greenspan was so confident that the economy was actually doing better than the official numbers indicated. There are really two phenomena that were going on. There's one that he emphasized, which was really a more progress-oriented one, and then there's one that he didn't emphasize as much that is a lot more zero-sum. So the progress-oriented argument that Greenspan made was, when we look at productivity statistics in service jobs, we don't actually see a huge increase in output per hour, but it just doesn't pass the smell test. That lawyers who went from dictating memoranda to a typist who would then type it up and mail it to the client in a physical letter, that if those lawyers stop doing that and start producing Word documents and just emailing them directly to the client, or if financial analysts and accountants used to be using manual calculators and copying numbers into physical books, and that now they're doing everything in Excel and they're doing it a lot faster, it just doesn't make intuitive sense that the productivity in those sectors isn't just soaring. So he argued that we probably just don't have a good way to measure it. We don't know things like how much better surgery is if a surgeon gets more effective, and if the combination of a surgeon and better surgical tools leads to just much more pleasant outcomes for the patients. We don't have a good sense of exactly how much more productive a lawyer or a stockbroker or an accountant is if they have these new technological tools. So we might as well assume that the GDP numbers and the productivity numbers understate the total growth in productivity. But the other thing that kept Greenspan really safe from runaway inflation was the rise in globalization throughout the 80s and 90s. So China in particular was exporting tons and tons of low value added goods to the US. There was basically no inflation to negative inflation in things like apparel, in furnishings, in toys, and electronics. And that was certainly positive sum in the utilitarian sense that a lot of very poor people in China were getting richer and joining the global middle class, whereas a lot of people in the US who were not rich by US standards, but in the global 95 to 99% were losing their manufacturing jobs because those jobs were being offshored. The net effect of that was that inflation was low because there was just an unlimited supply of labor in China at the time. And that meant that faster consumer spending did not lead to these price shocks and bottlenecks that used to percolate through the economy. But it did mean that all of this economic growth was making the US more and more tied to other countries. So in a way, having a looser monetary policy led to better GDP numbers, but also led to the US being a little bit less able to determine its own economic destiny.
I want to go back to something we were talking about earlier. You were talking about marriage. You've also written about how your thoughts on homeschooling and your kids. And so I'm curious how you think about the future of K through 12 and the future of higher ed. You also written about how YC is and Lambda are unbundling higher ed. How you think, are we going to have parallel institutions, or is not much progress going to be made in the next 10 to 20 years in education, or how do you think about that?
I think in the aggregate that homeschooling is just not going to make a material dent in K through 12 education in the near future. You have a lot of vested interests. You have a lot of people who have structured a lot of their lives around having their kids fairly busy during the workday. So there's just there's a lot of institutional cruft around it that makes it hard to get rid of. That said, I do think that anyone who was designing education for kids today would not derive the US public school system or even US private schools. They wouldn't derive that from first principles. That isn't what they would figure out was the right way to do things. I think if you were looking at the kinds of jobs that people have today that they find really fulfilling, you'd say that what kids need to learn to be able to do is to find a topic they're really passionate about, dive into it in as much depth as possible, just nerd out to the maximum extent possible, and then find something else once they've either reached the limit of their abilities or their interest has petered out. A lot of topics, you'd think that the result of that would be that someone would be way ahead of their grade level on a few things and then way behind on others. But a lot of these topics tie into each other really well. So if your kid gets obsessed with ancient Rome, you can just talk about military history. You can draw these maps. You can talk about the Caesars and how cool they were. But you can also talk about engineering. You can walk them through the math of why an aqueduct doesn't fall down. Also through the math of just how many aqueducts would you need and how much grain has to get shipped from Egypt to Rome before, lest people start starving and then start rioting. You can also teach them some chemistry, such as why lead pipes were really popular when engineers were trying to figure out what material to use, but didn't necessarily have great results for the people who were drinking water out of them. You can also talk about the Roman legal system. You can talk about Latin, and through learning some Latin terminology, you can see how that has come down to us today. You can also look at this sort of meta approach of saying a lot of people get really obsessed with Rome. They try to pretend to be Romans. They have this exaggerated idea of what Rome was, but then if you go back to the original Romans, they were basically doing the same thing. So the U.S. founding fathers, they all had these Latin pseudonyms when they were arguing with each other. They all had these really grandiose Roman LARPing approaches to public buildings and to job titles and things like that. And in some ways that's kind of goofy, but in another sense, the Romans were doing the same thing. Rome was originally a gang that took over several hills, and then they decided to turn themselves into an empire through iterations. So they basically wrote this semi-fake history of who they were and how they became what they were at that date, and then gave themselves an artificial inheritance to live up to. So there are just a lot of lessons you can get from any one topic. There are a lot of ways, if you are a parent and you're trying to guide your child into becoming an intellectually fulfilled adult, there are a lot of ways to get them to explore all the nooks and crannies of these ideas. But it strikes me that I would have been a lot happier if in some points of my childhood I could spend all of my time nerding out about ancient Rome, and at other points in my childhood I could spend all of my time nerding out about physics or the Apollo program or math or some other totally different topic.
Yeah. You mentioned pseudonyms. Segue into, I'm curious how you think about the future of identity. Is it going to be a pseudonymous economy where, as Balaji says, you don't put all your money into one bank account and you're not going to put all your reputation into one name? Or how is the concept of identity and reputation going to evolve over time?
Pseudonyms are a tricky topic. They're very leaky. Like you can't really get unouted once you're outed. Pseudonyms also require a substantial amount of work. So since you mentioned Balaji, I think it's appropriate to use the crypto analogy that any identity, whether it's your real world identity or a fake identity, and whether that fake identity is your MMO RPG character or your anonymous blog, it takes a lot of time to get any results that anyone would care about. So, anyone can just post something anonymously on 4chan or a site like that, or on Reddit or something, but no one will notice and no one will care. If you post something that is interesting because it's information that other people didn't have, then it really narrows down who you could have been. So if you go on Reddit and you say, I heard, I don't know, the CEO of Google say X about China. If that turns out to be true, then anyone who also overheard that conversation is immediately asking which of the 5 people in the room posted this on Reddit, and they will probably pretty quickly figure out who it was. Now, you might think that if you use a pseudonym to just say really insightful things, even though you don't have any special information, that maybe that's a useful way to cover your downside and still get the upside of being a good commentator. I think anyone who read the book Ender's Game before they first used the internet, which applies to me, used to think that was the case, because Ender's Game has this whole subplot where a super genius brother and sister team up to write this blog, and the blog ends up just totally redefining the global conversation. I think there was an XKCD parody of this where he just imagines it as a WordPress blog with zero comments, zero interest. That's what would actually happen, because as a lot of people in tech have noticed, superior technology, better product is important, but if you don't have really good distribution, then it doesn't matter. In the marketplace of ideas, really good distribution does involve pedigree or a social network. It's just a whole lot easier if you are a Harvard legacy admit to get your ideas into circulation, because you have a lot of friends from school, and a lot of people probably owe your parents favors, so your stuff gets published early and often and spread out throughout the world. There are not that many people who have an impact on the world by having original ideas, except in this really, really indirect way. And if you want to have that kind of super indirect impact, where it's not that you are making the essential decisions, it's that you are writing the stuff that's being read by the people who have input into the people who have input into the people who are making these really big decisions, then you just have to be aware that your ideas can get filtered into meaninglessness. That said, I do think that it is neat and healthy that it is so simple to spin up a pseudonym. It does become a problem when you can use pseudonyms to harass people or just say really horrible things. That is a problem, though, that a lot of social networks are keenly aware of, and they're aware that they need to mitigate it. So what I think that means is that there will always be a place online for pseudonymous commentary. It will be increasingly segregated from the rest of the internet, and it'll be a sort of internet equivalent to a bad neighborhood. So you can go there, you'll see a lot of bad stuff. Maybe you will get in some sort of trouble yourself, but you will also see things you wouldn't see elsewhere. So going back to 4chan, if you had happened to be on 4chan the morning that Epstein killed himself, or didn't, you would have heard about it, I think something like half an hour before the first news story broke, because someone did actually post around, they did post before the first story hit the wires that he had, that EMTs had been called, that he had no pulse, etc. But there's just a lot of garbage to filter through. Like, it's entirely possible that someone posted that every single morning, and that one morning they happen to be right.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're talking about 4chan, Reddit. You have a post about how filter bubbles are a good thing and important.
Yes.
It's interesting because we're seeing sort of the rise of TikTok, which has an interesting feed, is solely based on if the content is good as deemed by an AI, i.e., you're not punished if you don't have a ton of followers, and we can go to TikTok right now, create something really good, and it'll go super viral. Whereas it's harder on YouTube or Twitter without an existing audience. I don't know if that necessarily relates to filter bubbles, but why don't you talk a little bit about why filter bubbles are good?
Yeah, so the distinction I would draw is between real world filter bubbles and online filter bubbles. So online filter bubbles can become pathological, not necessarily because you miss a lot of good ideas, but just because they end up indulging your most dopamine fueled garbage impulses as a human being and as an infovore. So it's just really common if I'm on Twitter or on Facebook that the things that I'm most likely to click on are actually just things that I think are really stupid, or I can't believe someone would say whatever it is that this article's headline says. And that, of course, trains those algorithms to show me more things that I think are just outrageously dumb. So that does get kind of dangerous. It also gets dangerous if you're clicking on things that are outrageous and dumb, but that you happen to agree with. And there is a sort of swagger in taking the stupidest caricature of your beliefs and totally buying into it 150%, but probably not good for anyone's intellectual development. But where filter bubbles can be really effective is when you have a group of people who have distinctive and weird beliefs, and those people and those beliefs feed off each other, because then you can get the compound interest of different people exploring and attacking an idea from different angles, of people people who are friendly with each other, implicitly promising that they're not going to make fun of you if you say something just incredibly asinine about whatever Mars colony you and your friends are trying to put together, or whatever new crypto project you're trying to launch. That allows you to make a lot of progress in one specific direction, and to build a little bit of social solidarity with people who can help you implement the idea. So I think a lot of intellectual revolutions, a lot of political revolutions, they start with a couple people who are willing to hear one another out and willing to take an idea to the furthest extreme that it could be taken. And that does mean that if there is social progress in the sense of there are different social arrangements, they may not be optimal, but we can be at a local maximum. It can take a lot of energy to get to the next local maximum. That if those are valuable, which I think they are, then that basically requires this filter bubble. That requires a group of people without a heckler's veto to just keep pushing on the idea until it's inevitable.
And the other context in which people have talked about pseudonyms is journalism. People often mention how Ben Franklin wrote on different pseudonyms to sort of attack other pseudonyms. And the sort of broader question was journalism ever great? I'm curious if you want to respond to that, because people often fondly recall journalism's past glory days, either correctly or incorrectly. I'm curious for your view. And then also you've written a little bit about investigative reporting, and I'm curious what the future of journalism there looks like for you.
Sure. So in terms of people like Franklin writing under pseudonyms, there's a sense in which this modern idea of journalists as being trusted, neutral arbiters of the truth, it's really more a reflection of the way the economics of content distribution shook out in the middle of the 20th century. When we only had 3 TV networks, when most cities were single paper monopoly cities, you actually did need to tell people, you did need to hold journalists to a high standard because there weren't a lot of alternatives. And then as media outlets proliferated, it became a lot more viable for someone to be totally biased and insane and just scream things that other people in the audience would agree with. You certainly saw that with AM radio, and then with cable television. AM, for whatever reason, ended up being mostly right-wing. I don't know why that is. Maybe Democrats take the subway and conservatives are the ones stuck in traffic. And then cable ended up being ideologically diverse, but uniformly insane. So once you have all these different viewpoints, and once you can just change the channel, it becomes less essential that any given journalist always strictly adhere to the truth. It becomes more like journalism is a form of entertainment. And it may be that it is, and that it really should be, that journalists, everyone is basically some variant of The Daily Show, where you are entertaining an audience and provoking a reaction. You are using what is actually happening in the world as a hook, but you're under no obligation to always strictly, dispassionately report what's going on in the world. And that may be useful, because to choose what to report, you have to have some narrative. You have to have some coherent view of what's going on, because otherwise there's just too much to talk about, and most of it doesn't matter. So you already have to have some underlying viewpoint. You can call it a bias if you want. It may be that when journalists were totally dispassionate and neutral and whatever, that they were actually still adhering to a narrative. That narrative still had its biases. They're just not incredibly transparent to any of us. I don't know exactly what those biases would be, but they were probably there. So now to some extent, fragmented media and biased media is more transparent. Maybe you were never actually getting the truth, but at least you know that you're being lied to, and you know something about the agenda of the people who are lying to you. And why do you need to watch the news or read the news anyway? It's very unlikely to affect your life. Certainly very unlikely for you to have any direct effect on it. I would assume that people who are actually powerful, are able to affect the course of world history, are probably getting their news more manually filtered by people whose job is to provide an informed view to presidents, prime ministers, etc. There is a case, or there is a subset of news that is a lot less biased, but also a lot more boring, which is financial news. If you ever try to read an earnings call transcript or an earnings press release from a company that you don't follow in an industry you don't care about, it is just going to put you to sleep instantly. It's just really, really not fun to read, because the actual news, the actual developments are all these really tiny incremental things. There's not a lot of human drama. It's just, we thought sales would grow 3% this quarter. It was actually 2.5%. Here are the 5 reasons why. Now, if you do have a financial interest there, you care very deeply, and the difference between 2.5% and 3% can actually make or break your year. But it's just not that fundamentally interesting. So you can actually view financial news, you can view SEC filings as a case study in what news looks like when it's stripped of an agenda, which is, there's too much of it, most of it doesn't matter, you scroll until you fall asleep, and then you switch to reading whatever news site, HuffPo, Breitbart, whatever, that actually just gets you jazzed up because it's all outrageous and insane, and you want to inject it straight into your veins.
Ezra Klein has a book out called Why We're Polarized. I'm not sure if you've paid attention to it or reviews of it, but why are we polarized, and how do you see that changing or not changing?
One reason we're polarized is transparency, and one reason is slower growth. So transparency, since it is cheaper to start a news site in some sense, like it's cheaper to start a news outlet in some sense, there are more news outlets that appeal to more niche interests. So instead of CBS, ABC, NBC, you have this enormous long tail of different sites, and then you have social networks that aggregate them, that aggregate the most exciting, which is usually the most outrageous and counter-informative content from each of them, so that you end up seeing it. So we do have this system where it is really good. It's really easy to get the propaganda you like. It's also really easy to get the dumbest conceivable person who disagrees with you into your feed. And it is somewhat harder to track down the propaganda that you don't like. And you can actually track down the thoughtful, nuanced commentary from the ideologies that you don't like. Usually the stuff that gets published in books is going to be more thoughtful and more reasonable than the stuff that gets published in blog posts. All else being equal, just the higher production costs set more of a quality floor there. So you can track down the more thoughtful version, but it's actually kind of aggravating to find out that the people who seem to be totally dangerous and insane are actually reasonable people with slightly different premises from you. It's almost scarier. They go from just being demonic enemies to being these creepy pod people who sound just as reasonable as you think you sound, but come to uncomfortably different conclusions. So that's one reason we're polarized. Another reason we're polarized, though, is that when the economy is growing quickly, there's just more wealth to go around. So a lot of problems can be solved by sharing some of the wealth, whether that's sharing wealth to shareholders and landowners, or sharing wealth to workers, or sharing wealth to the unemployed. That's just a lot easier to do when there's more wealth every year. It's also a lot easier when the economy is growing to have giveaways to different parties that just happen in the future but get decided on right now. So that includes entitlement spending, that also includes pension funds, but it also includes corporate debt. So the investor in corporate debt is expecting money to get paid to them over the long term. So that is also a promise of tomorrow's economic output rather than today's. So when the economy is growing, it is easier to borrow money. It is easier for the government to choose entitlement programs that have a large actuarial cost, but not a significant immediate cash outlay. And that does keep people happy. But if growth slows down, if those pension funds are underfunded, if the debt has to get restructured, if there's just no way that the country can support the Medicare liabilities that it has today, then you start having something closer to a crisis. And one of the dynamics of this crisis that's particularly bad for government is that the government doesn't really have a concept of an organized liquidation. So in corporate America, once it gets to the point where a company obviously can't pay its bills, the last thing you want is to just have the company pay out cash to whoever presents claims first until there's nothing to pay out, and then the company to liquidate all of its assets to make good on other claims. That just encourages everyone to collect as quickly as they can. That encourages them to force the company to liquidate as quickly as possible so they get paid. What you actually want to do in that situation, which is what bankruptcy law is for, is you say, okay, the company has obligations that total X, but the most it can pay is half of X. So some people are going to get one haircut, some people are going to get a different haircut, some people will get totally wiped out, like shareholders may get wiped out, but suppliers and employees will get minimal to no losses on their debts. It's just a very organized way to prevent a company from getting liquidated if its problem is that it's a good business, but not as good a business as it looked when it got a bunch of fixed obligations. The U.S. government doesn't really have that. We don't have some process where we say, okay, we're going to default on 30% of Social Security, 20% of Medicare, and 80% of defense contracts or something like that. It'd be nice if we did, but governments just aren't set up to do that.
Peter Thiel's argument on the Eric Weinstein podcast was that the importance of economic growth, or one of the reasons it's super important, is that it curbs violence, basically. But also, it tends to increase economic inequality because the rich getting richer faster than the poor getting richer. And people say that rising economic inequality also creates violence. So what's better for reducing violence, economic growth or inequality? And are concerns about inequality overstated, or how should we think about this?
It is really tough to say, because if you look at research like Piketty's research, for example, on economic growth and the returns on assets, Piketty has this argument that in many cases, returns on assets are greater than growth. So over time, the rich end up owning all the assets. But if the rich are earning interest on their assets and they're not consuming all of that, then we end up with less consumption inequality than wealth inequality. So in terms of how you live day to day, it's not as egregiously unequal as it looks on paper. And also, if rich people are earning high returns relative to economic growth, then over time, they're a larger proportion of the economy. So economic growth slowly approaches the return on wealth. So in that sense, if you combine the lower marginal propensity to consume with the higher return on rich people's assets, you actually end up with this view where we implicitly entrust more and more of our collective wealth to the people who get the highest return on it. And then we do owe money on paper, but we still get nice things. That may or may not be a sustainable outlook, but the reason that we don't know whether or not it's sustainable is that historically it doesn't last. So with the exceptions of the United States and Australia, every country has had this near total drawdown in financial wealth at some point in its history. So the U.S., nominally, the Great Depression was that because the Dow dropped 90%, but the Dow circa 1929 is a lot more analogous to the NASDAQ today. It was the Dow Jones Industrial Average when industrials were a fairly recent category of equity investment. And a lot of people would have had bonds or real estate, other assets that didn't get hit as much. And there was significant deflation at the time. So in real terms, Dow didn't drop quite as much. So basically, the U.S. and Australia, which is a fairly small country, so it doesn't really matter in terms of determining the narrative, we don't have this experience of the massive wealth drawdown. But for every other country, that is basically how the reset happens, that when times are good, the return on wealth is greater than the growth in overall GDP. So over time, the wealthy as a class end up with more larger share of the country's resources, and then there's a war or a plague or something, and that all gets wiped out. But there's also the question of how permanently it gets wiped out. So there are not data points everywhere, but there are enough data points to get suspicious where wealth actually seems to persist in families even if the nominal wealth gets totally wiped out. So one of the case studies there is that someone came up with a list of, I think, aristocrats in Renaissance Florence, or the wealthiest merchants in Renaissance Florence, and then looked at the average per capita wealth of people with those surnames today, and found out that even after multiple wars and conquests and all sorts of upheaval and several centuries, that even then you were more likely to be well off, you're more likely to have a high status job and a postgraduate degree if you happen to be descended from one of these people. Another example of that is the descendants of wealthy slave owners in post-Civil War South. They ended up being wealthier than average, even though a lot of their land got expropriated, a lot of their wealth was burned down or otherwise destroyed. The Confederate dollar was inflated into being worthless. So they had probably a near total drawdown in wealth, but were still richer than average after that. You can also look at the Chinese Communist Party. A lot of senior members of the party today are descended from senior members a generation or two ago. A lot of the senior members of the Chinese Communist Party are actually people who spent a lot of their childhood doing forced labor on farms because they were part of the intellectual elite who Mao sent off to the countryside. So there's just there are a lot of examples of persistence of wealth even after this massive drawdown. One of the more interesting ones is this book, A Farewell to Alms, which looks at English property records. So we have really extensive, detailed records of English people's net worth. And what the author of that book discovered was that there was this cohort of people in England who tended to have a lot of kids, tended to breed above replacement levels, so they have a lot of descendants today, and they were not actually the super rich. So the poor tended to have a ton of kids, super high infant mortality, so they were stuck at the worst part of the Malthusian trap. The rich did not have quite as many kids, but they also had an extremely high murder rate. So a lot of rich people did not live long enough to have big families because they were stabbing each other. The people who did end up having big families and who also had somewhat lower infant mortality rates than average were the craftsmen, merchants, the middle class. So those people are disproportionately likely to be the people who the average English person is descended from today. And a lot of people have, in this really roundabout, indirect way, inherited a lot of those very middle class values. So in England today, as far as I know, it is fairly uncommon to murder anyone in a duel over your mistress, over the fact that you both have the same mistress or something. So that's another way in which wealth gets retained over a really long period is this set of cultural norms, where the cultural norms that keep you alive and that prompt you to save money over in the distant past would have led you to have more kids, and at present just lead you to have more money.
What do you think should be this big question, should be the proper role slash scope for Wall Street and finance broadly and or government? And what do you think is the strongest justification for each?
Sure. So they actually serve the same purpose, which is to coordinate a lot of people's behavior in order to pursue some distant, uncertain objective. So there are a lot of cases where you can have the same role performed by one or the other, and it almost doesn't matter. Like Milton Friedman had this point a while ago about Social Security, where he said that it's actually a combination of several government programs. One is a mandatory savings program. One is a regulation that you must invest your money in a specific annuity, and then another is that this annuity must be issued by the government at some return of X. But really, you could separate those. So you could imagine a system where you have the same payroll taxes. It's also money that you can't touch until you're 65. But every year when you pay these payroll taxes, you get a bunch of direct mail from Fidelity and Charles Schwab and State Street and everyone else, and they all tell you, if you put your money with us, here's what you'll get when you turn 65, and here's how the payout will change based on various life events, and here's the actuarial probabilities of these things happening. So you could imagine a system where you you privatize one end of Social Security and then you keep the system in place, and there's actually no real effect on anyone except that instead of Social Security being managed by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., it's actually being managed by bureaucrats in Boston or Manhattan. But you get roughly the same outcome. There's this striking parallel between financial bubbles and big successful government projects where they both coordinate a lot of behavior that is optimal if it happens in parallel, but not that useful if it happens in sequence. So if you look at the Apollo program, you could imagine the components of a spacecraft being invented over a 50-year period. So we, by the year 2000, have the capability to land on the moon, except that if you invent the rocket and there's no lander, then there's no market for your rocket, so you go bankrupt. If you invent the guidance computer, but there's nothing to guide, same deal. It's only viable to invent each of these components if you know that the project is going to literally achieve liftoff on some date. You can look at Moore's law and the PC revolution as something similar. So one of the reasons that Bill Gates is so rich today is that he realized that computers kept getting faster, they kept getting cheaper. That means that if you build something that is barely usable on today's computers, you wait 3 years and it's the best product on the market and runs just fine on the computers 2 generations later. So people like Gates were able to consistently they were able to build for that next generation of computers. And because everyone knew that Gates and his ilk were building applications for much more powerful computers than existed at that point, they knew to build those powerful computers because they knew they'd have a product that was compatible with the newest and latest and greatest software. So financial bubbles and governments are good at coordinating behavior. And then the question is just which one is better equipped to coordinate which kind of behavior. So if you are trying to race to cure some disease that is really, really common in extremely impoverished parts of the world, probably it's not going to be an especially hot IPO if the company that cures that disease goes public, but it is something that would make someone in the government feel really proud that they had done something good with their life if they're able to solve that problem. So maybe that is something the government should do. But if the question is, we've invented this cool technology, maybe it was by a university, maybe it was a government research lab, but we need it to be something that is, or we think that the best thing for the world is if this is something that's in everyone's home, that is really cheap and that everyone can use. That's something that the private sector is really good at, is taking technology that works and finding a way to market it, finding a way to brand it, finding a way to sell it to as many people as possible. Both of those systems do have cases where they break down. So both the government and the private sector can get into these vicious cycles where they exist to solve a problem. So they're sort of ranchers or farmers where they keep growing a new crop of the same problem and then selling a solution to that problem. So in that sense, you could view some police forces and Monsanto as being in the same business, where the police forces are run in such a way that there's always this low-level crime problem, and so they always have an excuse to be active in addressing that problem. Monsanto gives you something that gives you seeds that grow really fast, but they get devoured by insects unless you also buy the Monsanto pesticides. So it's in both cases they've become part of this epiphenomenon where there's a problem, they monetize the solution or they benefit from solving it, but they also benefit from keeping the problem around. There's not a good heuristic for deciding who does what, because a lot of it depends on cultural factors, whether that's at a national level, like the U.S. is just way more comfortable with risk than a lot of other countries, or certainly way more comfortable with risk than most European countries. So we would tend to have a bias towards the private sector because we're a lot more okay with people going bankrupt. But there's also skill gaps. So governments that can hire the smartest and hardest working people, they should probably have more power and responsibility, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where if the government is where ambitious projects get launched, then it's where ambitious people go. It's pretty hard to break out of that cycle, and it's probably going to vary also by field. So I don't have a lot of exposure to the healthcare industry, so I actually don't know the extent to which a government-funded lab or an academic lab or a private sector lab would be the place to go if I really, really wanted to cure diseases. I could see plausible arguments for any of those. Like, I'm sure if I wanted to cure baldness, then I'd want to work in a private sector lab because they're definitely going to be the ones who are good at selling that kind of cure. But for a lot of diseases, for a lot of other types of medical research, it's not immediately clear to me that the private sector would have the right time frame and outlook to be the place where the smart people go.
Have you come across Glenn Wales' arguments, basically calling for increasing returns? The idea that we either have private property on one extreme or public on the other extreme, and nothing sort of in the middle to take into account sort of the interweaving nature of both of them. For example, public, all the problems with public choice, but in private property, also the idea that, hey, when my house gets more expensive, it's not because any work I did necessarily, it's because the community made it more valuable, and yet they don't see any of the value from that. Or when Facebook gets really big, it's because of a lot of data that was collected by people who didn't sort of capture any of the value that they helped create. Are you sympathetic to sort of redefining organizations to better align incentives like private property does, but also sort of distribute the gains like public tries to do?
So I would push back somewhat on the notion that that either of those either of the claims on returns are as cut and dry as they sound. So in the case of someone who buys a house and the value of that house goes up because of other things that happen in the neighborhood, the price of that house reflected the expectation at the time that they bought it of whether or not those things would happen. So to some extent, they're actually getting paid a risk premium, where if the neighborhood had gotten really bad, or if the biggest employer in that town had gone bankrupt, then they would have lost a lot of money. And I don't think there would be a strong case for subsidizing them or making them whole. So to some extent, you can say that that's just how things shake out, that a house is an uncertain investment. In Facebook's case, I think it's a lot more dubious to argue that the people who gave Facebook their data didn't get anything of value out of it, because the way that you give Facebook data is by using the product and by being logged in all the time on every device that you ever use. So the fact that that's a common kind of behavior indicates that people get a lot of value out of Facebook. And in fact, that people are getting this huge consumer surplus. Like one useful way to measure that is the fact that Facebook's ad revenue is growing a lot faster than their usage, which indicates to me that Facebook is growing their business by capturing more of the surplus value that they create, which indicates that there was a lot of surplus value to be captured years and years ago. That said, you can solve some of those problems or align some of those incentives through pretty simple stuff. So on the land side, a land value tax does seem like a pretty obviously good idea, just because it is true that there are a lot of positive and negative externalities that are not well captured, or that are not easy to capture except through owning land. So to some extent, a land value tax would actually align incentives really well, where you would not be super happy or super disappointed if the government did something that affected the value of your land, because the change in that value would be reflected by a change in the taxes that you paid. So that is probably the closest that I could get to being on board with that. It's in the US, at least, we have this long history of businesses that are pseudo-public, pseudo-private, and they just all end up being huge disasters. Like in the 1970s, we had this really tightly regulated savings and loan industry, and the regulations didn't allow the S&Ls to react appropriately to changes in interest rates. So basically, savings and loans would borrow at 3%, so they'd pay 3% of deposits. They would lend at 6%, and they would lend for the long term. So they're basically betting that long-term interest rates don't go up too much, and they would make pretty safe bets. But long-term interest rates did go up a lot. They eventually went up past 15%. So at that point, if you're an S&L, you're massively underwater. And what the government did was it loosened restrictions on their ability to take deposits. It loosened their restrictions on what they could lend to, and basically allowed the industry to bail itself out by growing its way out of the problem. So if you have a bunch of loans on your books and the loans are underwater and your equity is actually worthless, and you just triple the size of your balance sheet, make a bunch of other loans, the loans are high interest, as long as those loans pay off, you can eventually get back to even. But it's injecting a lot of systemic risk into the economy, and by the early 90s, that system totally fell apart. There's a similar, I guess, somewhat analogous example in California in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the original plan was to totally deregulate their energy market, and there was a lot of pushback on that. So they came up with this system where it was deregulated in the sense that utilities could buy power from anywhere, that there was a market in wholesale electricity, but they wrote a ton of rules to limit the extent to which that market could be abused. The problem is, if you write a bunch of rules on how some complicated market should function, and then you basically tell the utilities you have to provide power for people in your market, and then you tell the energy sellers you can do whatever you want as long as you follow rules, you're incentivizing them to find interesting loopholes. So Enron found a ton of really clever ways to totally ruthlessly exploit the rules. Like they would do things like, one of the rules was, if you are trying to route power over some power line and the power line doesn't have enough capacity for that power, you get a premium to route it somewhere that does have enough capacity. So Enron would say, okay, we're going to route everything on lines that don't have enough capacity for that much power, and then we automatically get a premium when we reroute it on the route that made sense in the first place. They had a lot of different strategies that were similar to that, where there was some incentive built into the rules, and that incentive was supposed to be, if you accidentally do X, we'll pay you to do Y instead. And they realized that there's no way to know if doing X was an accident or not. So Enron basically was able to turn the California utilities into their own ATM. They made so much money that one element of Enron's fraudulent accounting was understating how profitable the trading business was. But since it's a trading business and since it was run by ruthless sociopaths, they recorded all their conversations in case someone made a deal and then reneged on that deal. And all of those recordings were discoverable. So once Enron was on trial for basically destroying California's electrical utility industry and plunging the state temporarily into the dark ages, there were all these nice recordings of people joking about how they were causing brownouts or making fun of elderly retirees who didn't know why their power was so expensive, all sorts of really nasty stuff. So basically public-private, pseudo-public, pseudo-private partnerships in the US, for whatever reason, tend to bring out the absolute worst in our system, and they also tend to be colossally expensive. So we shouldn't do them.
Social capital. I know you read the most recent Alex Danko post on social capital. I'm curious what you found interesting there, and the idea, you have this idea that we should have treat it like a monetary asset, or how can we relate social capital and financial capital?
Yeah, so the part of the idea of social capital as a concept is that people just derive joy from being the first person to discover someone brilliant and from introducing them to a bunch of angel investors and early employees who will then go on to help that person create a valuable company. So yeah, part of the Danko argument is just that angel investing itself doesn't pay. It isn't really worth the risk or the effort, but it is really high status. Or it's high status to do it well. So that's why people do it. So you could argue that it's sort of like being a musician or an athlete, where you might make a lot of money, but that shouldn't be why you do it, because there are probably easier ways to make money. In terms of treating it like a monetary asset, you can. It's certainly amenable to financial modeling. Like I like to think of nepotism broadly defined as just a credit market for reputation rather than for cash. So if you know someone, you know that they are a total unknown among your friends or among investors, but you can vouch for them. If you vouch for them and they turn out to do really well, that makes you sound smart and sophisticated and well connected. If you vouch for them and they turn out to steal everyone's money or be incompetent, that makes you look bad, and you have less reputational capital to deploy. So it ends up being a temporarily or an incrementally self-correcting system. Of course, you can end up with social capital inequality with people who are just totally locked out of the system, have no way to get in. And that might be analogous to a banking system where the banks are willing to lend money to literally anybody who doesn't need it and are not willing to risk money on new and uncertain projects. And it's in that case, it's a tough situation to deal with, because the actual optimal outcome is either A, for someone in that social capital ecosystem to defect from the system's norms, lend some of their social capital to someone who would normally be automatically nixed from that, or for somebody else to create their own independent social capital network. You can also think of it in financial terms by thinking of the money supply and bubbles argument. So while it's not true that every bubble is caused by an increase in the money supply, it is certainly true that an increase in the money supply can cause a bubble. So if you have an increase in the reputation supply, if there are just more people willing to vouch for more people, then you end up with too many bad ideas getting funded. And you also end up with people optimizing for getting recommended versus optimizing for building something good. So that also directly analogizes to financial markets. But well, it's the same phenomenon in financial markets, but there is not there's not as much to do about it, because it's not like you have a central bank of status. It's not like you can either avert status inflation or inject additional status into some set of people when there's been some big collapse in status. Like, if there were a central bank of status, then maybe post Theranos and post WeWork, it would have lowered the implicit interest rate on status, or printed up a bunch of status tokens and just distributed them as widely as possible. But that just doesn't happen. So in that sense, a status market is maybe analogous to the gold standard, where there can be inflation and deflation, and they're actually somewhat exogenous to the system. So you have to be very careful if you are relying on some steady trend in the availability of status.
If you had a couple minutes to explain what you find sort of different about financial bubbles, or are you sort of in the Alex Denko, Carlota Perez, Bill Janeway school of understanding financial bubbles, which is they're the necessary for the infrastructure of the next technological platform, or what's the best way or most unique way that you think about financial bubbles that you wish more people understood or appreciated regarding them in general, or maybe specific ones like 2008 or Japan in the 90s or any other?
Yeah, there's never one unifying theory that maps to every bubble. It wouldn't happen if there were a consistent theory that worked for every one of them, because you'd spot them before they got too big. So every bubble has this dynamic where some people will say expectations are too high, everyone's too wildly optimistic, people are throwing too much money at something that's not clearly going to work. And then other people saying, no, this is early, the first people to build whatever this new thing is will make so much money that it's actually going to pay for a lot of losses, a lot of poorly considered projects. Like, you can look at the internet bubble. People were skeptical of it starting in the mid 90s, starting in like 1995, 1996. It looked like it was crazy for a long time, and then it turned out that a lot of the predictions about what the bubble would change were actually entirely right. Like, we do spend a lot of our time looking at screens. We are all online all the time. The internet has changed shopping, it's changed relationships, it's changed entertainment, it's changed communications, it's changed culture. So the dot-com optimists were actually right, but the ones who got optimistic at the wrong time lost a lot of money. The ones who sort of created their optimism ex post because their neighbors were getting rich buying .com stocks. They wanted to get rich too. They ended up having these really shoddy copies because they didn't understand the core of the thesis, and so they ended up recreating some of the superficial elements of it. This you would start to see when Amazon was a hot stock in the 96, 97 timeframe, and other companies would launch online bookstores like Barnes & Noble, spun off barnesandnoble.com. That was a hot IPO. Books A Million, the stock, when Books A Million announced that they had a website, that was literally the announcement. It was just, there's booksamillion.com right now, and there wasn't before. The stock went from $3 a share to 50 over the course of 2 or 3 days. I think KTEL Records had a similar kind of spike for a similar reason. So a lot of these companies, the companies were doing a sort of shoddy copy way too late of what was actually being built, and investors were also doing a shoddy copy way too late of what smart investors had been doing a year or two before. Every bubble is going to be different because we all know what happened in the last bubble. We don't want to make that mistake again, so we'll make a totally different mistake. It might be cyclical, but you don't really know which. It's certainly not A, B, A, B, A, B kind of cycle. It's probably a longer cycle with epicycles. A bubble has to have a narrative. The narrative has to have some sort of external validity. So you do have to know what's going on in the outside world before you start framing things as a bubble. Like you can look at that back and forth dynamic where you have one kind of bubble and then a totally different kind of bubble if you compare 2000 with 2008. So in 2000, it was this bubble that was all about an inflection point, all about this radical change in what was possible, all about a whole lot of new wealth being created and being captured by a small number of very clever people and very powerful companies. In 2007 and 8, the bubble collapse was a collapse in this bubble about convergence rather than divergence. It was about every country catching up to the US in terms of GDP per capita. It was about volatility across all asset classes, whether it's currencies or commodities or housing especially, or loans backing housing, about all of those volatilities being compressed. It's about every stream of cash flows being modeled better and better. Like, we really did have these incredible achievements in how to think about modeling the values of different collections of cash flows, assuming that the correlations between them were knowable. It just turned out that if everyone's investing based on historical correlations and they all invest in the same basket of uncorrelated assets, then the marginal driver of pricing in those assets is those incremental investors. So if they all have to sell at the same time, correlation between historically uncorrelated assets goes to 1, and everybody gets wiped out. So those are totally different bubbles. Like internet stocks did not necessarily correlate that strongly with one another. There were different sub bubbles within the bubble. Like there was a media phase. There was a sort of user generated content phase towards the end. Towards like the late 90s, like late 1999 or so, a lot of the contracting companies, so the companies where they would pay someone $30 an hour to write Perl, and then they would rent that person out to a big company for $200 an hour. Those companies did well in 1999. And then in 2000, even after the NASDAQ bubble had peaked, there was this thesis that a lot of the router companies, network equipment companies, and enterprise-facing companies, they would still do well because everyone had raised so much money for their .com startup ideas in 1998 and 1999, they'd still have to spend the money. But it turned out that a lot of the money on infrastructure was spent ahead of Y2K. So all of the really old hardware and software was just ripped out and replaced with new stuff. So everything was shiny and new on January 1st, 2000, and then IT equipment CapEx just plummeted after that. So there were lots of little bubbles within that bubble that all had their own internal logic. And then if you were scared straight by that, if you said, I will never again be fooled by this chart that's screaming up and to the right, then the chart you get fooled by is a chart that used to be bouncing around, wobbling a lot, and that got steadier and steadier and steadier over time, because eventually that chart just goes straight down.
Last question. You had this post about why reading is better for ingesting information than podcasts or other things, and not just for certain people, but for everybody. And I took it personally a little bit. That's a bit strong, but I'm insecure, I should say, because I had recently decided that instead of, and this is a bit different than what you said, instead of reading nonfiction books about very complex topics, I should invite the authors on my podcast and just interview them, and maybe read a little bit to prepare for it, but that would be a more effective way to internalize sort of the main points and points of nuance that are and contention that are not necessarily in the book. Why am I wrong, or why is something about reading just so much better as a way of retention? Because I was having difficulty retaining sort of nonfiction books and big ideas, as opposed to just talking to people who they themselves have internalized it.
Well, I guess I'm a little bit of a traitor to my cause, because I am on a podcast right now. But what I would say is that the people you find, if you're in a position to talk to the author of a nonfiction book, that is probably more efficient, because a lot of books, if they're on a topic you're interested in, you already know a lot of the information, and what you really want is to read the book as if you're having an argument with the author, where you find the things they disagree on, or you find the little details that they knew that you didn't know, or the claims they make that you think are totally refuted by something you know. So it's much more efficient to do that if you can just get the authors to talk to you. I do agree with that. But the broader point that I was making was that writing has fairly low production costs for anyone with niche interests. So it has low production costs and low discovery costs. So if someone is going to write the definitive article on some software library or something, it's just it's super easy to find it on Google. It's super easy for them to just type and hit publish, and there it is. So that makes writing really good for long tail content. Writing also has these nice affordances for complicated ideas. You can scroll forward, you can scroll back. If someone uses a term and you realize that they introduced it earlier and your eyes happen to have glazed over at that point, you can just go back and search. It's really hard to do that within a podcast. And then there's just the fact that I've noticed so many smart people spend so much time reading, and that so many of the interesting conversations I have, it turns out to be a conversation between me based on the things I've read and someone else based on the things they've read. Either we have some overlapping things but different interpretations, or ideally our reading approaches have led to this Venn diagram where we've each gotten different obsessions that have some parallels between each other, but we've gone down different rabbit holes and can dig up some treasures from those rabbit holes to share with one another and swap. So I end up seeing that reading a lot just gives you a nice substrate for achievement in a variety of domains. It's certainly not a total substitute for conversation, but I would view it as a very valuable complement to conversation. And the main comparison I wanted to make was not so much reading versus podcasts, because podcasts versus reading, they do have the value of being consumable in different concepts, of being consumable semi-passively. Like, I'm not going to read a book if I'm washing the dishes or if I'm on a bike or running or something, but I can listen to a podcast. And in fact, when I'm doing cardio, which is not that often in my life, but when I am doing cardio, I do end up listening to podcasts while I'm doing it. So to that extent, podcasts do fit into some pieces of time that would otherwise be dead time. But what I was really going after was actually getting information from video, because video has really high production costs. So it has to appeal to a lot of people. That means it can't be niche, but a lot of people like the idea of having niche interests. So there's this tendency for online video creators to try to pitch something as niche, but to actually dumb it down somewhat, or to make it pseudo niche but actually pretty bland, and that's just the worst. But it makes sense that you'd package something as totally distinctive and narrow, and you, the viewer, are one of only a dozen people who could possibly comprehend this, and then you look at the viewer count, oh, it's not a dozen, it's 12 million. Clearly, this is actually not that niche, not that weird. It just costs a lot to make a video that is watchable, whereas it's really, really easy to go on Medium and produce a really nicely formatted blog post. Like, that's why I'm on Medium, was just I wanted to not waste between 1 and 30 hours on CSS to make the blog look okay. And Medium makes it look better than okay instantaneously, which means more time for the content.
You mentioned, I asked you earlier who's the most underrated intellectual right now, and you came up with Samo Buria, I think it is. Well, why Samo?
Samo thinks hard about institutions, about where they come from, why they persist, why they die, and that's useful. It's useful to me in an American context because of the drawdown problem I mentioned earlier, where Americans, for most of our cultural history, just haven't had this experience of getting totally wiped out and having to start from nothing again. And that makes us a very risk-tolerant culture, but it also makes us stupidly optimistic. So I think taking this broader historical view where you say every society collapses eventually, every empire falls, every institution ends up getting captured by people who are indifferent to or even antagonistic to its goals, and that if you care about achieving anything, you have to understand this mortality of every institution. That's really bracing and refreshing. It's an intellectual cold shower. And he's just a really deep thinker who's looked at a variety of historical issues. I think the thing he most recently changed my mind about actually goes back to the text versus video discussion, because he did point out recently that there is one category of information that YouTube has led to a revolution in, which is tacit knowledge, which is how you physically do something with objects in the real world. So if you want to fix a car or any household appliance, you can find a YouTube video in which someone demonstrates exactly how to do it. And that is something that I would not want to explain how to do in a blog post. I would want to actually watch a video of it. In fact, my wife and I have this pack and play for our kids, and every time a kid outgrows it, we disassemble it and stash it away. And every time we do, I watch the same YouTube video explaining exactly where to touch and what to hit and how to shift it around so that it folds up into this tiny storable object.
You've written about the tyranny of long generation. What does that mean?
The tyranny of the long generation refers to this phenomenon where when an industry is growing quickly, it continuously hires more people, it continuously hires a new cohort of people every year. So the average age tends to be pretty young in that industry. So you can look at something like banking in the 80s and 90s, consulting and law around the same time, tech in the 90s, tech in the 2010s. These are industries that are growing really quickly. A lot of people join the industry out of college, and what happens in an industry that's growing like that is that there are a lot of opportunities for upward mobility. So if the company you're at is doubling in size every year, then if you've been there 2 years, 3/4 of the employees have been there less time than you, you've accumulated social capital, you can probably end up managing people and working on interesting stuff. But where things get difficult is when an industry's growth slows down, because when that happens, they stop hiring a lot of new people, a lot of young people, and the average age of that industry starts going up. That has a couple side effects, one of which is that it means more people remember more bad stuff. So people they have long memories for disasters, and people who were in an industry where something bad happened, but before they joined, they don't really care about it. So one really interesting example of this is the financial services industry, especially money management and the stock brokerage industry. So after the crash of 1929, there was this roughly 20-year period where essentially nobody who went to Harvard Business School went to work on Wall Street. And what that meant was that by 1950, the average age for the industry had to be in the 50s. A young person in the industry would have been 40 or so. So when people like Warren Buffett and some of the early go-go hedge fund managers, or go-go mutual fund managers of the 1960s, when they started to join the industry, there was not a lot of competition, especially for higher risk stuff. So a lot of these go-go fund managers, they would look at tech stocks, and at the time tech would be things like Polaroid, Xerox, IBM. For someone who'd been investing in 1925, 1926, et cetera, they remember 1929. They remember what happened to RCA, General Electric, to all of the hot tech stocks of that age. So they were pretty averse to that. In Warren Buffett's case, he wasn't looking at tech at all, although he did some tech investing with his personal money. He was looking at a lot of companies that had very complicated financial structures. And this is something that people also had really bad memories of from 1929 and the Great Depression. So if you're Warren Buffett, you're looking at some small publicly traded company that has a really complex holding company structure. And when you do all the math and net out all the liabilities, you realize this company is trading at a fraction of its cash on hand. And if the company liquidates, all the investors will make a fortune. That gets Warren Buffett really excited. But to a normal investor who remembers 1929, it just reminds them of the trusts or the insult companies or all of these really levered financial pyramids that fell apart as soon as the economy slowed down. So that gave people like Buffett and other people who had joined the industry this de facto monopoly on the most interesting corners in the industry. So it lends itself to two pieces of advice, one of which is if you're in an industry that's growing very quickly and you start to see it slow down, you should get very concerned. You should consider switching careers, because what will happen is in a slow growth industry, a lot of ambitious people have joined the industry. They have expected things to expand. They've expected the ambit of their responsibilities to grow. And if it doesn't, they start to get more political, more Machiavellian. If it's not positive sum, it'll be zero sum. And if it's zero sum, but you have some really aggressive and unethical people, it's immediately negative sum. For a lot of people, they themselves are not inclined to do this kind of zero-sum office politics gamesmanship, but if they know other people are going to do it, then they have to do it as a purely defensive measure. So that's one reason to be really cautious about any industry where growth is slowing. The converse of that is if you are choosing a college major right now, or you're choosing among career options, try to pick the one where that major peaked in popularity in the late 70s or early 80s, because that's an industry where a lot of people will retire. So it's an industry where a lot of the institutional memory will shrink, the risk tolerance will go up, there will be a lot of opportunities to do something much more interesting.
You know, Ezra Klein had this critique of Silicon Valley in his most recent episode with Tyler Cowen. He said, you know, the way Silicon Valley approaches big ideas and politics is they make a lot of things that sound crazy, and it's like venture capital. One of them is going to be right and really right, but most of them is going to be wrong. And I found it a pretty clever way to basically dismiss Silicon Valley's sort of approach to thinking about politics or thinking about the world outside of technology. Do you think that Ezra's critique is unfair, exaggerated, right on? How do you think about that?
I think it's really impressive that he is willing to embrace such an ideologically conservative viewpoint. Very, very open-minded. Experimentation is a lot more appropriate in the private sector than in the public sector, because in the private sector, it's really easy to fail. Like, there are high-profile failures where everyone wonders how this company raised so much money when it was obviously fraudulent, but they're high-profile failures. High-profile failures for the government are often programs that still exist and are still spending money, and that someone is still in charge of, and they're still gradually getting raises for running. So a totally different kind of failure. Like, I want all of the crazy ideas like that have a high risk of failure. I want a lot of them to be implemented by the private sector, unless they require the kind of coordination that governments can provide that private sector can, in which case we should be really cautious. We should ask how to get extremely competent people into government to implement those things. Dominic Cummings is trying to do that in the UK right now. I don't think that a Cummings-like figure exists in the US, although I hope someone like that does. I mean, statistically, we're a bigger country. We should have someone like that. Perhaps we do. They're just lower profile. But yeah, that is generally what I would say to Ezra, is that the private sector is pretty good at identifying failure. In fact, one of the cases where we're not good at identifying failure is with private companies that have a single major backer that keeps investing more money. But where that gets tricky is that when I offer that framing, you probably think of SoftBank investing in WeWork. So SoftBank invests in WeWork, and then WeWork raises another round. SoftBank puts in more money at a higher valuation. So it looks like SoftBank's stake is continuing to appreciate, but really SoftBank is the only entity willing to pay remotely close to that price for WeWork stock. But in his Reddit Ask Me Anything a long time ago, Peter Thiel had the argument that that when a company raises money and it's the leader of the round is a repeat backer and everyone says it's overvalued, it's probably undervalued. And the more overvalued people say it is, the more undervalued it actually is. And Facebook would be a classic example of that, where every round that Facebook raised, people talked about how this is the peak of, at first, the Web 2.0 bubble and then the social media bubble. And every round that Facebook raised turned out to be a very good deal for its investors. So that is a case where the private sector is not very good at spotting problems, but it's also a case where the private sector actors who are creating those problems have disproportionately more money at stake, and so they lose disproportionately more when it doesn't work out. Like the punishment for WeWork's failure, or the drop in WeWork's valuation, is that it's extremely hard for SoftBank to raise Vision Fund 2, and that a lot more investors are really nervous about the signaling value of taking money from SoftBank. So they are actually getting penalized even disproportionately to the amount of capital they lost. And that's just less common in government. In government, if you have a failed program that's supposed to address some problem and it doesn't address that problem, well, now the problem is bigger, so we need the program more than ever.
Describe the argument you make, or the business book's rare coins argument.
Sure. So these are both arguments about what information we have and what selection mechanism causes us to get that information and not information from other sources. So with business books, I first started reading business books in probably 2001 or 2002, and I was really, really spoiled because a ton of books came out about the dot-com bubble, and then about Enron, and they were all really dishy, had lots of details, were very eloquent and well-written. So I was just under the impression that if you care about reading long-form stories about business, you will always have something fun to read. But that wasn't the case. By 2004, 2005, it was pretty much a wasteland. And then in 2009 and 2010, you started getting really good books again. So what I realized was that a couple things have to happen. That one thing that has to happen is that you need smart, well-informed people who are not really, really busy making a ton of money, who can talk to an author instead. So this has to be either after the exit or after they've lost a ton of money and are really resentful. You want them to have an incentive to tell their side of the story, because then you have a clean, coherent narrative. Of course, it's a biased narrative, and a lot of the authors of these books don't really recognize that, because a lot of successful business people have to be really good at telling a story, because that's how they raise capital, and a lot of them are also salespeople. They're also recruiters for whatever company they're running. So they have to be really, really good at articulating a vision. This is a trap Michael Lewis falls into all the time, where he, like Flash Boys, it's at one level, it's the story of a bunch of these sinister nerds manipulating the financial system to steal money from mom and pop investors. At another level, it's a story about a guy whose job was to be a trader and a salesman. He was not a great trader, but was an excellent salesman. And, or at least he was not a trader who was adaptable to changes in the structure of the market, but was still a really good salesman. And he sold Michael Lewis very well on that narrative of high frequency trading. So that's where business books come from. Another reason that the books after a crisis are so good is that they actually fit the structure of a Greek tragedy, where you have someone who is heroic, sort of superhuman, but has some moral flaws. They eventually fly too close to the sun. They get punished for their hubris. So it's this nice, neat narrative. And you find the hero relatable at first and hateable by the end. So you sort of like it. There's a reason that those are Greek tragedies, that we've had them for 2,000 plus years. It's the kind of thing that clicks with the human brain. With rare coins, a friend invited me to a coin show, and I'd never been to one before. And it was surreal, because when you go to a rare coin show, you can just touch the coins. And you can't go to a museum and have someone just hand you a 2,000-year-old statue. But I was holding a coin that an ancient Roman would have used to buy their bread or wine, that an ancient Athenian would have used for probably similar purposes. And that was, it was almost dizzying. But what I learned is that the coins that we have are generally coins that people stashed somewhere and that they didn't recover. So if you have a bunch of coins, it's probably because you have some money. It's probably because the rate of return on wealth is greater than economic growth. So you as a member of the craftsman or merchant class or the banking class, you're able to accumulate wealth over time. You bury it because you want to keep it safe, and then somebody kills you and burns down your city, and so you don't recover the money, and some archaeologist finds it millennia later. So in that sense, the coins that we have are this this snapshot of when times were good and suddenly got bad. It's a little bit analogous to some of the earliest writings that we have on clay tablets, where a lot of Mesopotamians would take notes on clay tablets, write down contracts on clay tablets, or keep tallies of inventory. And most of those tablets could be reused because it's clay. But if you were doing that and your city got razed to the ground, the raising process bakes the clay, so it saves it from RAM to ROM, and we just have this permanent snapshot of what business was like right before business got extremely bad.
Another thing we were thinking about is why Peter Thiel wrote this book about how monopolies, and yet why in so many industries are there duopolies or multiple power players when it looks like there should be one dominating?
Yeah, so it's a striking phenomenon because there are a lot of spaces where you can name a monopoly, and it's pretty obvious that there should be one, like Facebook monopolizing social networking because you wouldn't join a social network your friends aren't on. They're all on Facebook, so you're on Facebook. Google monopolizing search because to continuously optimize search results, you need a lot of data points on what people search and what they subsequently click. So if you have high market share and even decent engineers, you will maintain your high market share and be able to afford lots of those engineers. So monopolies, it seems pretty obvious that they should we should expect them to exist in any technologically dynamic sector. We should expect them to periodically get killed or get regulated into submission. But we're not surprised to see them. But duopolies are weird. It's weird that there would be two companies that are really good at producing sugar waters. So you've got Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Nobody really thinks that Coca-Cola is going to beat Pepsi or vice versa, but they're both very nice, profitable businesses. In aircraft, you've got Airbus and Boeing. In travel search, you have Booking.com and Expedia. So it is weird that there would be duopolies in some sectors and not in others. And what I suspect is that it's going to be a different story in each case. So with Coca-Cola and with Pepsi, you do need ubiquitous distribution and you need ubiquitous marketing. So the reason that these work as companies and as cultural phenomena is that if you can buy Coca-Cola anywhere, then Coca-Cola can advertise anywhere and remind you that you like it. And if they advertise anywhere, then you will go buy it. So it's a nice virtuous cycle. It's probably the case that Coca-Cola and Pepsi expanded in different parts of the country. They expanded at different paces at different times. And it may just be that there's enough mindshare out there for one, for two companies, but that three would not be profitable enough to persist. Like there are lesser colas out there, but if you're a fan of one, it's usually out of some ironic sense or some just perverse love for the underdog. The products are pretty similar, so I think everyone with an opinion on how similar they are has read the same Buffett biography I did, where it's the Lowenstein one. The Lowenstein Buffett biography, in which he talks about how Coca-Cola launched New Coke because Pepsi did an ad campaign where people did blind taste tests and they're like Pepsi. And Coca-Cola knew exactly why. Pepsi is 4% sweeter and people love sweet things. As a side note, there's a fascinating article in the New Yorker a couple of years ago called The Fruit Detective about a guy, a really interesting backstory but his job was to find exotic new fruits and sell them to high-end grocery stores. And his friend, the author of the article, tracks him down and asks him, what is the secret to identifying the next great fruit? And he says, well, find something that's really sweet. It turns out that all the subtleties, all the notes and flavors and things, that doesn't matter. What matters is more sugar per bite. So Coca-Cola, they designed New Coke. It's a little bit sweeter than Pepsi instead of being a little bit less sweet than Pepsi, but people don't like it because they don't like the brand name. And what may be going on is that it's a Hotelling's law situation. So Hotelling is an economist. He has Hotelling's rule, Hotelling's law. They're both very useful constructs, but totally unrelated to one another. The rule is that, maybe it's law, one of them is that competition, when there are two competitors and they're competing along one axis, you would expect them to be as close to each other as possible while still maintaining some visible differentiation, because that way, if you imagine, the example he gives is, imagine that there are two ice cream stands on a beach. You want to be located as close to the center as possible because that maximizes the number of people who are closer to your ice cream stand than the other person's ice cream stand. Anytime that you move away from the center, they should move right next to you, because then everyone on their side is still closer to them and you don't have as many people on your side. So Hotelling's law can explain it when there is just one axis. So if it's just ubiquitous national distribution and nonstop national advertising are table stakes, and then the axis of competition is sweetness, then Coca-Cola captures everyone who is either from Atlanta or has slightly less of a sweet tooth, but still likes cold carbonated beverages with a little bit of a caffeine kick. And then Pepsi captures everyone who is not from Atlanta, has a bit more of a sweet tooth, and has the same beverage preference. That works for Coca-Cola and Pepsi. That also works for Republicans and Democrats, where the cosmetic differences are definitely visible to everyone, but the policy differences are a lot less meaningful, especially if you talk to the actual people off the record and find out that they all think roughly alike. They just exaggerate the differences for sort of pro wrestling storyline reasons. But it doesn't do a good job of explaining the online travel agencies. So there's really not a Booking.com flavor or Expedia flavor. Like there's not an axis on which they're all that different. But in that case, what is likely going on is that building up the network, so building up the list of destinations, is this extremely time-consuming and tedious process with network effects, localized network effects. So Booking had this amazing position in Europe. They had this long, long tail of tiny independent European hotels, and Expedia and its subsidiaries really didn't, but Expedia did have a better position in the US. So in that narrative, they both basically grew to the point where their network effect was robust enough that they could expand into one another's markets. Neither one of them had a great opportunity to do so. So they both sort of got stuck in at close to parity, at duopoly status. And then in their case, there's also the supply chain of attention argument, where a lot of travel decisions will at some point pass through Google. There would be basically two bidders, and then other companies are at some point sending their traffic to Expedia or to Booking. So in that case, the two of them are sort of fighting it out for this one channel, but they've both fully saturated the channel, and there are not a lot of other channels for them to pursue. So then the question is, why are they both pretty good businesses? And the answer to that may just be that travel was a sector that should have gone digital, that did go digital, and that continues to go more digital. Like, as bizarre as it is to think, there are some people who are not going to start their travel decisions on Google, and every year more of those people make the switch, so the businesses continue to grow. And they just have, so that can be the story up to 2009, 2010 or so. And then the story thereafter can just be economic growth has continued, that the richer people get, the more they spend on travel. So there's been an economic tailwind to both companies that has made the businesses look better than they perhaps fundamentally are.
What are topics you expect to write about in the near future?
Yeah, so I do have, I basically want to figure out what the early stages of the Cold War looked like. What's going on between the US and China is not the same thing, but there are doubtless some fruitful analogies. Other stuff that I want to write about, I have a couple things in progress. There's some natural experiments that I think speak to the question of the extent to which the market is or is getting more dominated by automated traders. So you can look at statistics of what percentage of trades are algorithmic trades, but that's not really telling you what percentage of the intentions behind trades are totally algorithmic and have no human input. There are some natural experiments, some cases where humans would be less likely to participate in the market and robots would not be less likely to participate in the market. So you can use those, check those over time to see whether or not the pure robot thesis is actually valid. One thing I'm looking into is residential real estate as a way to capitalize economic rents from monopolistic companies or globally dominant companies in mostly headquartered in San Francisco, but also in New York, and also to capitalize the economic rents of landlords restricting housing supply. The basic thrust of this argument is that if you look at the housing price to income ratio, it hit a huge peak in 2006. It declined substantially since then, and it's been creeping up. But the areas with a lot of housing price inflation are generally areas with really good upper middle class knowledge economy kinds of jobs. So what I suspect is actually going on is that if you move from Dallas to San Francisco or New York, the percentage of your income you spend on real estate does go up, but your quality of life can also go up because you're making so much more money. And so you, even after your higher rent, you have more money left over. So in that case, the rising ratio of housing prices to incomes is not a huge problem. One last thing I'm working on is the Norwegian economic miracle, which is the fact that Norway is a country with a small population. They discovered some very valuable natural resources, lots and lots of oil, and the result is that they are slightly richer than the most direct comparable countries, so Sweden, Denmark. Usually natural resources, if you discover natural resources that are worth a huge fraction of your GDP or that multiply your potential GDP, it usually just totally wrecks your country's institutions. So the question is basically, why is Norway a fairly normal country? What allows them to survive this massive wealth creation? I think that'll be an interesting one. Like if you compare Norway to Russia or Saudi Arabia or Qatar, it's just a much more balanced economy, and it has a political system that is less focused on maintaining control of the natural resource versus doing things that normal governments just do.
Yeah. Are there lessons that the U.S. should learn, or other countries should follow from there? Or is it?
Well, the U.S. doesn't need to learn a ton of lessons there because we are such a big country and we have such bountiful natural resources that we've basically been stress tested as much as we can conceivably be stress tested by this super abundance of wealth. So it's made the U.S. just the best place to be. We mostly lucked into it, although certainly a lot of people have also worked very hard to earn it. But I don't think there are a ton of lessons for the U.S. I think there are probably lessons for any country that has a large oil discovery of just how do you make sure that what you end up with is a large sovereign wealth fund and a slightly more robust social safety net versus having a country that is basically an armed camp protecting the oil wealth of a small number of powerful people. And I guess one last thing that I want to write about, which is an interesting political phenomenon, is the change in the role of residential real estate price appreciation in politics. So if you go back to the mid-2000s, one of the theses that George W. Bush had was that he noted the correlation between owning a home and voting Republican, and he decided it was causal. and that if you make it easier to own a home, you get more Republicans. That turned out not to work especially well. It was either at best, it was a really expensive vote buying scheme. At worst, it was just totally wrong. But there are two data points that I think are notable, one in the US, one in the UK. In the US, you have the Trump tax cuts that were actually pretty bad for homeowners in expensive states, or at least not especially good for homeowners in expensive states. And then in the UK, there's this interesting incident where during the Brexit debate, a politician gave a speech where he warned that in the event that the UK left the EU, that housing prices could drop 15 to 18%. And it turned out that this did not, the thought was we're warning people that their biggest asset will decline in value. It turned out a lot of Tories were just not persuaded by that, but a lot of younger voters who were not super politically engaged, they were actually really excited by the idea that there was maybe a chance that a house could get cheap enough for them to buy it. So what I suspect is going on is that housing used to be this super middle class asset that if you could make housing prices go up, you'd make the middle class better off. The middle class tends to be conservative, so if you're a center-right party, that's what you want to do. But now housing feels so out of reach for people that you can create this new political coalition by telling people that they have a chance to own a home, even though it means that you are soaking the homeowners by increasing the supply of housing or weakening the tax incentives for owning a house and levering up that house. All of these things will make existing homeowners worse off, but if they are the reason that someone owns a home, then that might get that person to support a particular political party. So I don't think that this means that the Republican Party or that the Tories will become the party of young people, like young urban workers who are finally buying their first home. But I do think that it should be a concern for anyone who assumes that there's a strong political mandate in favor of continuous housing price appreciation, because that may not be the case in the future.
I think that's a great place to wrap. My guest today has been Byrne Hobart. Byrne, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.